Don't. The word tore out of Clara Whitmore's throat before she could stop it, raw, desperate animal. Every head on the dusty street turned. The big cowboy froze mid-reach, his scarred hand suspended in the air between them, fingers open, touching nothing. Clara pressed herself flat against the stagecoach door chest, heaving eyes wild with a terror that had nothing to do with Wyoming, and everything to do with what men's hands had done to her before. The entire town of Red Hollow held its breath, and then Eli Mercer did the last thing anyone expected. He stepped back. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. Clara had rehearsed the moment 100 times on the long ride west. She told herself she would be composed. She would step off that stagecoach like a woman who had choices, not like a woman running for her life. She would shake the rancher's hand, speak calmly, and give nothing away, not the bruises beneath the long sleeves, not the fear coiled like a spring behind her sternum, not the 3 nights she'd spent in a Cincinnati boarding house eating half portions because she couldn't afford full meals and a train ticket both. She had rehearsed being fine. She had not rehearsed what happened when a man with a face like cracked leather and eyes the color of a winter sky reached for her traveling bag with one enormous scarred hand, and every muscle in her body screamed, "Run!" "Don't!" The word came out before she could catch it, and then the whole street was watching her. She felt their stares like heat from a stove, the woman behind the general store counter, 2 old men on a bench, a young boy in a too big hat sitting on a fence post. All of them silent. All of them witnessing Clara Whitmore come apart in the first 30 seconds of her new life. The man, Eli Mercer, the name on the letters, the name on the contract her father had signed without asking her, stood with his hand still half raised and his face doing something she didn't have a word for. It wasn't anger. It wasn't amusement. It wasn't the cold patience she'd come to recognize in men who were simply choosing the right moment. It was nothing she had a category for. He lowered his hand slowly, let it hang at his side. Then he took one deliberate step backward, putting distance between himself and her that she hadn't asked for out loud, but apparently her entire body had screamed for. "Easy now, sweetheart," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need volume behind it. "Nobody's gonna hurt you here." Clara stared at him. Her heart was still slamming against her ribs. Her fingers were still white-knuckled on the strap of the bag. She hadn't let the driver take the bag she'd held on her own lap for 3 days on that stagecoach, because it contained everything left of her life, and she was not letting go of it for anyone. She waited for the edge to come into his voice, the slight hardening. "I didn't mean to frighten you, but you're making a scene that she'd heard so many times it had its own rhythm in her memory." It didn't come. Eli Mercer just stood there in the Wyoming sun, one thumb hooked in his belt, his scarred face utterly calm, and waited. Clara started, stopped. Her throat felt like sandpaper. "I can carry it myself." "All right," he said simply. "Just that. All right." No argument, no explanation of how heavy it was, or how far they were walking, or how unreasonable she was being. He turned slightly toward the wagon at the edge of the road, giving her the small mercy of not being watched full on, and said, "Wagon's just over here when you're ready." Clara stood on the wooden platform for a moment that felt much longer than it was. She had come to Wyoming territory because she had no other option, because her father had sold her. There was no softer word for it, to a man named Victor Blackwell, for enough money to settle a debt. And when Clara had told her father she would rather die than marry that man, he had used his fists to explain to her that her preferences were not relevant. She had spent 6 days in her room after that conversation, moving carefully, because of her ribs, planning carefully, because she understood clearly, finally after 24 years, that no one was coming to save her. She had saved herself. Barely. With stolen money and borrowed courage, and a mail-order advertisement in the back of a ladies' periodical that a well-meaning neighbor had slipped under her door with a note that said only, "There are other ways out." She had written to 3 ranchers. Only Eli Mercer had written back in full sentences. She had not known what that meant until now. She picked up her bag and walked toward the wagon. The ride out to Broken Ridge Ranch took the better part of 2 hours, and Eli Mercer spent most of it not talking. Clara spent most of it watching him sideways, cataloging threats the way years of survival had taught her to do. She noted the rifle laid across the back of the wagon bed, loaded from the way he'd checked it before they left town. She noted the breadth of his shoulders and the easy authority in the way he handled the reins, and the scar that ran from his left temple down to the edge of his jaw, silver white against weathered skin. She had known he was scarred from the letter. He'd told her plainly the same way he'd told her the ranch was solvent but not wealthy. The arrangement he was proposing was legal and binding, but she would have her own space, and she was under no obligation to be anything other than what she was willing to be. She had reread that letter so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. She had wondered what kind of man wrote a letter like that. Now she was sitting 3 feet away from him on a wagon bench in the middle of nowhere, and she still didn't know. "You hungry?" he said without looking at her. She hadn't eaten since early morning. "I'm fine." He reached behind him without taking his eyes off the trail and produced a cloth bundle that turned out to contain half a loaf of bread and a thick slice of salt-cured ham. He set it on the bench between them and said nothing else. Clara looked at it. She thought about refusing it on principle because accepting small gifts from men had a way of becoming currency. They later claimed she owed them. She thought about the hollow ache in her stomach. She thought about how she'd already made a scene in the middle of a town she had to live in, and she was sitting in a wagon in Wyoming territory with nowhere left to run to. She picked up the bread. "Thank you," she said quietly. He guided the horses around a rut in the road. She ate and he drove, and the silence between them was something she couldn't identify. Not comfortable, not threatening. Just present. Like weather. "Your last name is Whitmore," he said eventually. "Your letter said Boston." "Yes." "Long way to come." "Yes," she said again. She waited for the question underneath the statement why or who are you running from or what did you do, but it didn't arrive. "Mountains behind the ranch get snow by September," he said instead. "I should have the winter stock in by then." "You good with cold?" Clara blinked. Yes, I'm from New England." "Good." He nodded once like that settled something important. "Ranch hands are decent men. Tom Briggs has been with me 12 years. He'll leave you alone unless you need something. Young fella named Pete talks too much, but he works hard. I'll introduce you when we get there." Clara turned this information over carefully. He was telling her who would be around her, who she might need to navigate. He was doing it, she realized slowly, so she would know. So she wouldn't be surprised. "Nobody's gonna hurt you here." She pressed her thumbnail into the soft bread and said nothing, because she didn't have words yet for what it felt like to be given information instead of instructions. The ranch was not what she'd imagined, but it was solid. Everything about it was solid. The fence posts driven deep, the barn built to take hard weather, the main house 2 stories with a wraparound porch that had clearly been repaired more than once, but repaired well. It had the look of a place that had faced hard things and stayed standing. Clara noticed she was doing it again, reading a building the way she used to read rooms. Looking for exits. Looking for warning signs. Old habits. Tom Briggs was a quiet man in his 40s with a gray beard and the polite, deliberate manner of someone who had decided long ago not to pry into other people's business. He touched his hat brim when Eli introduced her and said, "Ma'am," and that was the extent of it. Pete, the young ranch hand, opened his mouth, caught something in Eli's expression, and limited himself to a brief, enthusiastic, "Welcome to Wyoming, ma'am. It's real nice to have you," before retreating to the barn at a pace that suggested he'd been given prior instructions. Clara almost smiled. Eli showed her the house with the same quiet economy he seemed to apply to everything. "Here is the kitchen. Here is where the wood is kept. Here is the sitting room. Here is the room at the end of the hall that is yours." He opened the door and stepped back to let her look. It was a simple room. A bed with a quilt in faded blue and yellow. A window that looked toward the mountains. A writing desk beneath it. A small iron stove in the corner already laid with kindling. A braided rug on the floor. And on the inside of the door, a solid iron bolt. Clara stared at it. "Lock works," Eli said from the hallway. "Keys on the desk. Only one key." She turned to look at him. His face was doing that unreadable thing again. Not performance, not calculation. Just a kind of steady patience that she didn't know what to do with. "Why?" she asked. She meant it as a full question. "Why give me a lock you can't open? Why give me a room that's fully mine? Why bring a stranger into your house and immediately hand her the means to shut you out?" But only the one word made it out. Eli considered the doorframe for a moment. "Because you should be able to sleep," he said. Then he walked back down the hallway and left her there. Clara stood in the middle of the room for a long time. Then she closed the door, and threw the bolt, and stood with her back against it in the silence, breathing slowly, and felt for the first time in longer than she could remember that she was not waiting for something to go wrong. The first week was a study in careful distance. Eli was up before sunrise every morning. By the time Clara came downstairs, there was coffee on the stove and usually something set out bread from the previous day, cold biscuits, once a bowl of early plums someone had brought over from the neighboring Haskell farm. He didn't make a production of it. The food was simply there. They ate breakfast together in a silence that was becoming, Clara recognized with alarm, almost comfortable. She had not expected to have things to do. She had imagined something closer to the arrangements she'd heard of women brought west to cook and clean and be available, their usefulness measured in the narrowest possible terms. But Eli came in from the morning chores on the third day, poured himself coffee, and said without preamble, "You know anything about horses?" "A little. My uncle had a farm." "Want to learn more?" She looked up from her cup. "You don't have to," he said, already turning back to the window. "Tom handles most of it, but they're good company if you're stuck inside yourself." Clara set her cup down. "Yes," she said. "All right." And that was how she found herself standing in the corral that afternoon, while Eli Mercer showed her with unhurried precision how to approach a horse that didn't know you yet. Not from the front, too startling. Not from behind, too dangerous. From the side, he said, where they can see you coming and decide you're not a threat. "Let them come to you when they're ready," he said. "If you push, they'll bolt. If you wait, they'll get curious." Clara stood very still, with her hand outstretched, and felt the big bay gelding stretch his nose toward her palm. "There," Eli said quietly. She thought about that for a long time afterward. It was Tom Briggs who told her on the fourth day about Eli's face. She hadn't asked. She had been careful not to ask the same way she'd been careful not to ask about anything that felt like it belonged to someone else's private history. But Tom had a habit of talking while he worked, aimed at no one in particular, and she'd been helping him mend a section of fence, and he'd said conversationally, "He got that scar pulling a boy out of a burning barn. Boy was 9 years old. Rancher's kid from up near Laramie." Eli didn't know them, just saw the smoke. Clara kept her eyes on the wire she was holding. "How old was he?" "Eli 2021 maybe. Boy lived. Eli spent 6 weeks in bed after." Tom pulled the wire taut. "Tell you this because some people look at his face and make up their own story about it. Figured you'd rather have the real one." Clara thought about that scar, the way Eli never seemed to think about it. Never angled his head to minimize it. Never offered explanation or apology for it. The way it was simply part of him, unremarkable. "Thank you," she said. Tom shrugged. "Man's a good man. I've worked for a fair number of men in my life. Not that many of them are good." He went back to the fence, and Clara went back to holding the wire, and she filed that information away beside everything else she was slowly, unwillingly collecting about Eli Mercer. Jack. She almost left on the 6th night. Not because anything had gone wrong. That was the terrifying part. Nothing had gone wrong. For 6 entire days, nothing had gone wrong, and Clara's nervous system, trained over years to anticipate danger at every turn, had been wound so tight, waiting for the thing she knew must be coming, that she sat upright in her bolted room at 2 in the morning and thought, "I need to go. Because this was exactly how it started with her father too, with a period of careful calm, with patience that turned out to be strategic, with kindness that was really just a longer game. She got dressed. She pulled her bag from under the bed. She had her hand on the bolt. And then she stood there. She had no money. She had a few dollars from the last of what she'd stolen, not enough for a ticket anywhere. She had no connections in Wyoming, no one who knew her name. She could walk into Red Hollow, and then what? Go back east to a father who would immediately contact Victor Blackwell. Live in another boarding house until she ran out of money entirely. She had run as far as she could run. She sat back down on the bed with her bag in her lap and thought with terrible clarity, "If he's going to hurt me, let me find out. At least I'll know." She unpacked her bag. She lay back down on top of the quilt. She did not sleep for a long time, but she stayed. On the seventh morning, she came downstairs to find Eli sitting at the kitchen table with a book open in front of him. He looked up when she came in, and she noticed for the first time, without immediately looking away, that his eyes were a genuinely strange color, not gray, exactly something between that and blue, the color of water under clouds. "Morning," he said. "You read?" she said before she could think better of it. He glanced at the book, then back at her with a dry expression that on a different face would have been amusement. "Some." "I didn't mean—" She stopped. "I'm sorry. That was rude." "No, it wasn't." He turned the book so she could see the cover. It was a collection of essays Emerson, she realized, recognizing the spine. "Man at the dry goods store in Laramie gets in shipments twice a year. I put in an order once. He's been sending me whatever looks interesting ever since." A small pause. "I don't read fast, but I get there eventually." Clara poured herself a coffee and sat down across from him, which was the first time she had sat at the table without choosing the chair closest to the door. "I read quickly," she said. "My mother taught me. She used to say—" She stopped again, surprised at herself. She hadn't talked about her mother in a long time, hadn't trusted anyone enough to. Eli waited. "She used to say that books were the only place a woman could go, that no one could follow her." Clara finished quietly. Eli looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the book. "Sounds like a smart woman," he said. "She was." Clara wrapped her hands around the cup. "She died when I was 12. I'm sorry." He said it simply, the way he said most things, without the performance of sympathy that usually made her feel worse. "After that," Clara said, and she was not sure why she was saying this, "my father became different." She chose the word carefully. He decided that since she was gone, everything in the house belonged to him to manage as he saw fit, including me. Eli said nothing, but she saw something shift in his face, something quiet and focused, like a man who had just heard something important and was choosing how to hold it. "You don't have to tell me any of that," he said finally. "You don't owe me your history." "I know." Clara looked at her coffee. "I'm telling you because I want you to understand." She stopped, started again. "I came here afraid. I'm still afraid. Not of you specifically, just afraid. Of everything. Of how fast things can turn. And I wanted you to know that's not—" She made a small, frustrated gesture. "That's not a comment on you. That's just what I am right now." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a rooster was making his opinion about the morning very clearly known. Somewhere in the barn, Pete was whistling off-key. Eli closed his book, laced his fingers together on the table, and looked at her with those strange water-colored eyes and said, "Then we'll go slow. No rush on any of it. You tell me what you need, I'll tell you if I can manage it. Anything I can't, I'll say so straight." A pause. "That work for you?" Clara had been bracing. She realized, feeling the careful tension leave her shoulders, for something else. For the qualification. For the but. For the moment when patience turned out to have a price tag. There was no but. "Yes," she said. "That works." He nodded once, picked up his book, and went back to Emerson. And Clara sat at the table and drank her coffee, and felt beneath the fear that was still absolutely there, would be there for a long time. Yet something she had almost forgotten existed. The very small, very cautious beginning of trust. That evening, she asked him about the rifles. She'd noticed them the first day cleaned and loaded, lined up in the rack near the front door, with a deliberateness that went beyond the ordinary rancher's practicality. 3 of them. Ready. "You expecting trouble?" she asked. He was on the porch checking the latch on the shutter. He didn't answer immediately. "Ranching's unpredictable," he said finally. "That's not an answer." He looked at her. The sun was going down behind the mountains, and the light was doing something gold and sharp, and he stood there in it with a saw in his hand and said, "No, it's not." Clara held his gaze. "I told you something this morning, something real." "Yes, you did." "Then I'd like something real back." The shutter latch clicked into place. He set the saw down on the porch rail and turned to face her fully, and his expression had shifted into something she was learning to read as his version of serious, which on Eli Mercer's face looked like absolute stillness. "A man named Victor Blackwell has resources and a long reach," he said, "and men like that don't take well to losing what they think belongs to them." Clara felt the cold move through her before she had time to prepare for it. "You know about Victor. Your father sent a letter to half the ranchers in Wyoming before I responded to your advertisement," he said, "warning them not to engage with you. Said you'd run from a lawful engagement." He picked up the saw. "I didn't respond to that letter." Clara's hands were cold. "What did you do?" "Wrote to you instead." He moved past her toward the door, then stopped. Looked back over his shoulder. "Victor Blackwell is 4 days' ride from here, and he doesn't know where you are. Those rifles are insurance, not emergency. You can sleep, Clara." He went inside. Clara stood on the porch in the fading light, with her heart beating very fast, and her hands shaking slightly, and a realization spreading through her like cold water. Eli Mercer had known. He had known from the beginning, not everything but enough. He'd known she was running, known there was someone chasing, and he had answered her letter, and loaded his rifles, and given her a room with a lock, and never once mentioned it. Not until she asked for the truth directly. He had just been quietly, completely without fanfare, preparing to protect her. Clara looked out at the mountains going dark against the sky. She had survived a long time by trusting no one. She was beginning to think that might have been right as a rule, and wrong about this particular man. She went inside and threw the bolt on her door, and lay in the dark listening to the Wyoming wind, and thought, maybe. And even that small, frightened, half-formed thought felt against everything she knew, like the beginning of something real. She did not tell him thank you in the morning. She had lain awake half the night rehearsing ways to say it to acknowledge what he'd done. The rifles, the silence he'd kept about Victor. The letters her father had sent poisoning the well before she'd even arrived. And by the time the first gray light came through her window, she had decided that thank you was the wrong word entirely. Thank you was what you said when someone held a door. Not when someone quietly built a wall between you and the thing hunting you without once making you feel like the problem. She came downstairs, poured 2 cups of coffee, set one on his side of the table, and sat down. Eli came in from the morning check 20 minutes later, pulled off his hat, and stopped when he saw the cup. He looked at it, looked at her. "Morning," Clara said. "Morning." He sat down and picked up the cup and said nothing else. And Clara understood with a clarity that surprised her that this was exactly the right exchange. That between people who communicated the way they were beginning to communicate, a cup of coffee, placed deliberately on the right side of a table, could say everything that words would only make smaller. That was the morning of the 8th day. By the morning of the 15th, she had stopped counting days. The thing about fear, Clara was discovering, was that it didn't simply leave when safety arrived. It lingered. It attached itself to ordinary moments and made them strange. A raised voice, 2 farms over a horse, moving unexpectedly. Tom Briggs walking up behind her in the barn while she was focused on something else. She'd spin around with her heart already in her throat, ready for impact, and it would just be Tom with a question about the feed supply, his weathered face patient and carefully expressionless, waiting for her pulse to settle. He never mentioned it. Tom Briggs was, Clara decided, one of the most tactful human beings she had ever encountered. "Does it bother you?" she asked him one afternoon when they were both repairing a section of the west fence, and she'd done it again, flinched hard at the sound of a hammer strike from the barn. "The way I am." Tom chewed on that for a moment, the way he chewed on most things. "Nope," he said. "You don't find it exhausting? Walking around someone who jumps at shadows. Had a dog once. Tom said pulling wire came to me from a fella who'd treated it poorly. Took that dog 8 months before she'd let me touch her ears without flattening herself to the floor." He tied off the wire. "Best dog I ever had. Smart, loyal. Once she figured out I wasn't him." He shrugged the way he shrugged at most things that other men would have made speeches about. People aren't so different. Clara held the wire and thought about that. "Eli told you," she said. Not accusing, just placing the fact. "Eli told me enough," Tom said. "Rest I figured myself." He moved to the next post. "You don't need to perform being fine for any of us, Miss Clara. Nobody here's keeping score." She didn't cry. She was too surprised to cry. She just nodded and kept holding the wire, and something in her chest, some tight calcified thing that had been braced for judgment, released a fraction of an inch. It was not a dramatic moment. It was just true. Eli started teaching her to ride properly on a Thursday. Not the gentle introduction she'd had with the bay gelding letting it come to her hand. Actual riding foot in stirrup weight, balanced heels down, hands quiet. He had a patience for instruction that matched his patience for everything else, thorough, unhurried, free of the barely contained frustration most men showed when something didn't happen immediately. "You're fighting the movement," he said, walking alongside her while she worked the gelding at a slow walk around the corral. "Horse goes left, you brace right. Let yourself move with him." "I'm going to fall." "Probably," he agreed. "Everybody does. You fall, you get up, you get back on. That's the whole lesson." Clara tightened her grip on the reins. "I mean it," she said. "I am genuinely going to fall off this horse. Then I'll catch you," he said simply, the way he said most things that turned out to be more significant than their surface, and kept walking. She didn't fall that day. She came close twice, once when a jackrabbit launched itself out of the scrub near the fence and the gelding shied sideways, and once when she tried to post the trot and completely lost her rhythm and grabbed mane with both hands. But she didn't fall, and by the end of the hour, her lower back ached in an entirely new and specific way, and she was unreasonably proud of herself. "Again tomorrow?" Eli asked, looping the reins to cool the horse. "Yes?" Clara said before she'd even decided. He glanced over. For just a second, the corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was adjacent to one. But Clara caught it, filed it somewhere careful, and thought, there. That's what his almost smile looks like. She was paying more attention than she meant to be. 3 weeks in, she started making herself useful in the ways she actually knew how. The account books had not been touched in 6 months. Eli's recording was accurate, but unsystematic numbers crammed into margins, receipts folded and stuffed between pages, with no particular logic. Clara found the ledger on the desk in the small room off the kitchen that served as his office, and she looked at it for a long time. And then she looked at the receipts, and then she spent 2 rainy afternoons organizing everything into a system that would make sense to someone who was not in her head. When Eli found her there on the second afternoon, she was 3 hours into reconciling the spring cattle sale figures and had completely lost track of time. "You don't have to do that," he said from the doorway. "I know." She didn't look up. "Your feed costs are running about 12% over what they should be for your herd size. I think you're getting shorted on weight at the mill in Casper." Silence. "I did my father's books from the time I was 16, she said, aware she was explaining and not sure why she felt the need to. "He didn't trust the men he hired, so he trusted me instead." A pause. "That's the one useful thing I took from that house." She heard him move into the room. He pulled the chair from the corner, turned it around, and sat down across the desk from her. "Show me," he said. So she showed him, column by column, what should be there against what was. The discrepancy wasn't catastrophic. He wasn't being robbed blind, but it was consistent, and it was real. And by the time she finished explaining it, Eli's expression had settled into something flat and focused, that she recognized as the look he got when he'd made a decision about something and was simply working out the sequence. "I'll go to Casper next week," he said. "You could send a letter first, give them the chance to correct it voluntarily." "Could." He considered it. "Or I could go to Casper." Clara looked at him. The flat, decided quality of his face had something in it she recognized from the rifles, from the way he responded to threats, not with noise, but with quiet, thorough action. She filed this away too. Eli Mercer did not bluster. He just moved. "Go to Casper," she said. He almost smiled again. The night she told him everything about Victor, it was raining hard enough that the sound of it on the roof made the kitchen feel like its own separate world. She hadn't planned it. She'd been working on a letter to a woman she'd known in Boston, not a close friend, someone from the church reading group, someone who had looked at her bruised jaw the previous winter with careful, deliberate eyes and never once asked about it directly. Clara had been trying to write something true, without writing anything dangerous in case the letter was intercepted, and the effort of crafting that particular kind of careful truth had worn something down in her, and she'd looked up at Eli across the table and simply started talking. She told him about the first time her father had hit her. She'd been 17, and she'd told him she wanted to go to teacher's college, and he'd explained in the clearest possible terms that her ambitions were not the point. She told him about the years of learning to read rooms and manage moods, and make herself smaller and quieter, and less likely to be the thing that set off whatever was building in the atmosphere. She told him about the night her father sat her down, and told her with genuine bewilderment at her lack of gratitude that he had arranged a match with Victor Blackwell, powerful, wealthy, connected, and that the signed agreement was already complete. She told him about Victor himself, the 2 dinners she'd been required to attend before she ran, the way Victor looked at her, not with desire, but with inventory. The way he spoke to the servers at the restaurant, quiet and absolute, in the tone of a man who expected the world to arrange itself around him and was mildly interested in correcting it when it didn't. She told him about the rumors. The first wife gone to consumption, the second wife fallen down the back stairs. Both deaths quiet and neat and settled before anyone looked too closely. And she told him about the last night when she'd gone to her father and said she would not do it. She would not marry that man. She would leave before she let that happen, and her father had explained again, with his hands this time, until 2 of her ribs answered differently than they should. When she stopped talking, the rain was still going, and the lamp between them was burning low. Eli had not moved throughout any of it, had not made the sounds people made when they were performing sympathy, the small interjections, the sharp inhales, the "how awful," and "I can't imagine." He had just listened with his whole body absolutely still in the way she had come to recognize meant he was taking something fully in rather than preparing his response. "How long ago?" he said. 4 months, slightly more." "The ribs?" "Healed," she said. "Mostly." He nodded slowly. He was looking at the table rather than at her, which she was grateful for, because she was not sure she could hold someone's eyes through what she'd just said. "My mother left my father when I was 11, Eli said. His voice was level. She had not heard him talk about his family before. "Took my sister and walked 20 miles to her brother's place in the middle of winter." A pause. "I stayed because I was too stupid and too stubborn to think I needed to." He looked up. "It took me 4 more years to understand what she'd understood in the first 5 minutes of their marriage." Clara held his gaze. "The scar," she said carefully. "Different story." His expression shifted, not closed exactly, but bracketed. "I'll tell you that one another time." She accepted this. In the economy of their particular communication, another time was a promise, not an avoidance. "Victor will come," she said. "You know that." "Yes." "He has connections. Legal ones. My father signed a contract. in the eyes of certain courts. Clara. He waited until she stopped. I know. That's why tomorrow we're going to Red Hollow and talking to Judge Harlan. His eyes were steady on hers. If you're willing. Her heart stopped, then started again faster. What are you saying? I'm saying the arrangement we have isn't legal protection, Eli said. It's just an agreement between two people. Victor Blackwell has money, and lawyers, and a father-in-law who already sold you once. He kept his voice even, not pressuring, just laying out the landscape. A marriage certificate on record with the county is different. It's standing. It's hard to argue against in a Wyoming court. Clara looked at her hands on the table. You'd do that, she said slowly. Change from this to legal for protection. I'm asking if you want to, he said. Not telling you it's what you have to do, and not... He paused, and she heard him choose his next words with unusual care. Not making any claim on what it would mean beyond protection. If that's how it stays, that's how it stays. If it changes, that's a different conversation we'd have later, when you have enough ground under your feet to make a real choice. The rain came down. The lamp between them was nearly out. Eli? Clara said, and her voice was steadier than she expected. If I said yes to that, right now, tonight. She looked up at him. Would you be saying yes to just the legal part? Or are you saying yes to... She couldn't finish the sentence. Not yet. But she held his eyes and let the incomplete sentence sit there in the space between them, and he understood it. She could see him understand it. He was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. I wrote you back, he said finally, when I could have written to any of the others. I didn't need a wife to run this ranch. Tom and Pete do fine. I read your letter, and I wrote back because... He stopped. Something moved across his face. Because the way you wrote, the sentences you chose. There was a person in those sentences that I thought I'd like to know. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. So I suppose I'm saying yes to both. Clara exhaled. Tomorrow, she said, we go to Judge Harlan. The corner of his mouth moved. That almost smile. Yes, ma'am. She picked up the lamp before it burned all the way down and went upstairs, and she sat on her bed in the dark with her hands in her lap, and she understood with the strange, frightened clarity of someone standing at the exact edge of something enormous that she had not been wrong about Eli Mercer from the first moment she looked at him. She had simply been wrong about what she was reading there. The marriage took 11 minutes. Judge Harlan was a dry, practical man who did not appear surprised by much of anything, and he married them in his office with Tom Briggs as witness, and Pete hovering in the hallway, trying to look casual and failing completely. Clara wore her best dress, which was not very festive, but was clean. Eli wore a shirt that was ironed, which she suspected was not ordinary. When Judge Harlan got to the part about the ring, there was a brief silence, and then Eli reached into his shirt pocket and produced a simple silver band that looked old, worn at the edges, with the soft patina of something that had been handled rather than displayed. Clara looked at it. My grandmother's, Eli said quietly so only she could hear. If you don't want it, I can get something from the jeweler. She held out her hand. The ring fit. She thought later that there was probably some significance to that, some frontier romance meaning she was supposed to feel, but what she actually felt in the moment was practical and solid and real. She was now legally and on the record Clara Mercer. Victor Blackwell could come with every piece of paper her father had ever signed. This paper was newer. Pete shook Eli's hand so enthusiastically that Eli had to brace himself. Tom touched his hat brim at Clara and said, Ma'am, same as the first day. But this time there was something warm in it underneath the economy of the word. And driving back to the ranch in the afternoon with the ring on her finger catching the light, Clara said, Thank you. Eli looked at the road. Already told you you don't have to. Not for protection, she said. For asking. He didn't say anything, but she saw his grip on the reins ease slightly. Sig. It was Pete who created the situation that led to the dancing, and Clara would never entirely forgive him for it, and also, she would always be glad. He'd come in late one Saturday carrying a battered fiddle that belonged to his cousin, visiting from Laramie, and he'd looked between Eli and Clara and said with the particular brand of hopeful stupidity that only the very young could sustain, "We should celebrate the marriage proper. I can play 3 songs." "Pete," Eli said. "4 if you count the one I only know halfway." "Pete, the barn's got good floors." "We're not dancing in the barn, Pete." "You're right," Pete said, undeterred. "We can move the wagon out and use the whole space. That's better, actually." What followed was 17 minutes of Pete maneuvering the situation with the cheerful, oblivious persistence of a border collie, moving sheep until somehow Clara was not entirely clear on the sequence of events. She was standing in the cleared barn space, with Pete sawing enthusiastically at his fiddle, and Tom sitting on a hay bale, looking like a man who had decided to enjoy the show, and Eli was in front of her with his hand out. "You don't have to," he said. She took his hand. He danced the way he did everything without showiness, with a kind of careful precision that was actually, Clara realized halfway through the first song, quite good. He kept space between them, enough that she never felt crowded enough that she could have stepped back at any moment. His hand on her waist was light. Asking, not claiming. The fiddle was uneven, and Pete lost the melody once, and recovered it badly, and Tom started clapping time to help him stay on it, and the whole thing was objectively slightly chaotic. Clara laughed. It came out of her without permission, not a polite laugh, not the careful, covered, oh how amusing sound she'd spent years producing on cue. A real one. Surprised out of her by Pete's expression of intense musical concentration while his fingers fumbled and the notes went sideways. She felt Eli's hand tighten the smallest amount on her waist. She looked up at him. He was watching her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Something open in it, something that had no strategy in it at all, just honest reaction. Like he hadn't expected it either, and hadn't had time to put anything over the top of it. She stopped laughing, and they looked at each other for a moment that had too much in it to name. Then Pete hit a triumphant final chord that was at least in the right key, and Eli stepped back, and the moment resolved into applause from Tom and Pete's slightly breathless bow. "One more," Pete said hopefully. "No," said Eli. "Right," said Pete. "Right, got it." Clara walked back to the house with the laughter still in her chest and the print of Eli's hand still warm on her waist, and she stood in her kitchen, their kitchen. She was still adjusting to that, and understood that she was in trouble. Not the kind of trouble she'd spent her whole life running from. The other kind. The kind that arrived quietly and made you want to stay. She found him on the porch 2 nights later, reading in the last of the evening light, and she sat down in the other chair without asking and said, "I want to teach you something." He looked up. She had the book of poetry she'd brought from Boston Whitman, worn and heavily annotated in her own margins. She opened it to a page she'd marked before she came out. "Read this," she said, holding it out. He took it, read it slowly the way he'd told her he read, working through it without hurrying. She watched his face while he did the slight movement of his brow, the stillness that meant he was actually inside something. "Again," he said when he finished. "Out loud." "Yes, if you want." He read it out loud. His voice was low and unhurried, and he hit the rhythm without seeming to know he'd found it, and Clara sat in the last of the light and listened and thought this man, this impossible man. "What does it mean?" he said when he'd finished the part about the open road. "What do you think it means?" He was quiet for a moment. "That the journey doesn't end somewhere. That moving forward is the point, not the destination." He handed the book back. "That what you become on the road is more real than where you were trying to get." Clara looked at the page. "Yes," she said. "Exactly that." Eli looked at the mountains going dark. "You should keep teaching me," he said. "If you're willing." "I'm willing," Clara said. And she was. She was willing in ways that had nothing to do with poetry, and everything to do with what she'd spent her whole life being told she couldn't want a man who read to understand, instead of to perform, who danced carefully and laughed rarely, and meant both things when they happened, who had loaded 3 rifles against her past and said nothing about it until she asked. 2 days later, she found a rectangle of fresh-turned earth on the south side of the house. She stood looking at it for a long moment before she understood what it was. "Roses," Eli said from behind her. She turned. He had a paper packet in his hand, seeds from the look of it. "You said you missed them. Back east." He set the packet on the porch rail. "Ground's right for it here if we plant before September." Clara looked at the turned earth, at the seed packet, at him. "I mentioned that once," she said, 3 weeks ago." "You mentioned it once?" He confirmed, and went back to whatever he'd been doing before, as if that were perfectly ordinary. As if the fact of him having remembered having turned the earth, having found the seeds, were simply what a person did. Clara picked up the seed packet. She stood there for a long time, and felt moving through the last of her resistance, the way water moves through dry ground. Slow, and then all at once the thing she'd been fighting since the first morning he'd set food on the table without making her ask for it. Not gratitude. Not obligation. Not the careful, strategic warmth of a woman who needed to manage the man she was bound to. She was falling in love with Eli Mercer, and that terrified her more than anything Victor Blackwell had ever threatened, because this she could actually lose. This was something real enough to break her. She pressed the seed packet between her palms and looked at the turned earth where her roses would grow. And she let herself be terrified. Because the alternative was retreating back behind the wall, and she had been behind that wall long enough. The roses came up in late August. Thin green shoots first, then stronger growth, and Clara checked them every morning with a care she hadn't given anything in years. She knew what she was really doing. She was watching proof that something planted in good ground given time and the right conditions could survive. Could more than survive. Could grow. She and Eli had settled into a rhythm by then that had the easy quality of something that fit, not without edges, not without the occasional moment when they both went quiet, because they'd run up against something neither of them knew how to say yet, but fitting the way good tools fit a hand. Naturally. Without force. She taught him Whitman, and then Longfellow. He taught her to read weather by cloud formation, and to judge a calf's health by the angle of its ears. She took over the account books entirely, and found 2 more discrepancies in the supply records that recovered nearly $40 when she brought them to Eli's attention. He went to Casper and had a conversation with the mill operator that Tom said with considerable satisfaction lasted under 10 minutes and resulted in a full correction going forward. "What exactly did you say to him?" Clara asked at dinner that night. "Not much," Eli said. "Tom says the mill operator looked like a man who'd seen a ghost." "Tom exaggerates." Tom from across the table said nothing, but the expression on his face said everything. Clara looked at Eli. He met her eyes and went back to his food, and she thought, this man, this impossible specific man, and felt the familiar warm terror of it move through her chest the way it did every day now, and she was learning slowly and perfectly to let it be there without running from it. She had not told him she loved him. The word sat in her like something she was still learning to carry. But she had started reaching for his hand at the end of evenings briefly, and he always let her, and that was its own language, and they both knew it. That was the world at the end of August. It ended on a Tuesday. She heard it from Mary Haskell, their neighbor from the farm east of the creek, who rode over with a jar of preserved peaches and a look on her face that Clara recognized immediately as the look of someone who had been thinking about whether to say something all the way over and had only just decided yes. "There's a man in Red Hollow," Mary said without preamble the moment Clara opened the door. "Arrived yesterday. Eastern. Expensive. Going around asking after you." Clara's hand tightened on the doorframe. "What kind of asking?" she said carefully. "Money kind." Mary's eyes were direct and unhappy. Offering $20 to anyone who could tell him where Clara Whitmore was staying. Didn't seem to know she was Clara Mercer now. A pause. Tall man, gray at the temples, looks at people like they're furniture. Victor, The name moved through Clara like ice water, and for 3 seconds, she was not in Wyoming at all. She was in her father's parlor. She was at the dinner table watching Victor Blackwell speak to a waiter, in that quiet, absolute voice. She was looking at a contract already signed with her name on it, and her father telling her to be grateful. "Clara," Mary's voice firm and close. "You look like you're about to go over. Don't." "I'm not," Clara breathed. She made herself breathe. "I'm fine." "You are absolutely not fine, and that's all right, but you need to tell Eli before he hears it from someone else." Clara was already reaching for her coat. Yak. She found Eli at the north fence with Tom and told him in under 2 minutes flat fast, without the fear in her voice that she could feel pressing against the inside of her throat. Tall man. Eastern. Victor Blackwell's description down to the gray temples. $20 on her location. She watched Eli's face while she talked. The stillness came over him immediately, that focused absolute quiet that she now understood was not absence of reaction, but its opposite. It was the look of a man whose mind had gone entirely clear and was moving very fast behind calm eyes. "How long ago?" he said. "Mary said yesterday." He looked at Tom. "He'll have someone talk," Tom said. $20 is a year's wages for some people. "I know." Eli was already moving toward the barn. "Get the horses." "Eli!" Clara caught his arm. He stopped and looked at her, and she made herself hold his eyes, even though what she actually wanted to do was go back to the house and bolt the door and pretend Wyoming was far enough. "You don't have to go to town. We could just wait. See what he does." "Clara." His voice was quiet and completely certain. "I'm not waiting in my own county for a man who's come here to take what's mine." He said it without heat or drama, just fact, and then he looked at her hand on his arm, and something in his face softened the smallest degree. "Go back to the house. Take Mary with you if she'll stay. I'll be back before dark." "I'm coming with you." "No. He came for me," Clara said. "I am not hiding in the house while you go face him. That's not—" She stopped, found the real word. "That's not who I'm trying to be anymore." Eli held her gaze for a long moment. "All right," he said. "Stay close and don't speak first." She let go of his arm. Tom was already bringing the horses. Mug. Victor Blackwell was sitting in the Red Hollow Hotel dining room when they arrived, drinking coffee and reading a newspaper with the particular studied calm of a man performing patience. He looked up when Eli walked in, and the shift in his expression was minute, a fractional adjustment, the way a man's face moves when something he expected to be simple just became slightly more complicated. He hadn't seen Clara yet. She was a step behind Eli's shoulder. Then he did. "Clara." He set the newspaper down. His voice was warm and measured and made her skin crawl the way it always had, because it was the voice of a man who had calculated exactly how warm and measured to sound. "I'm relieved you're safe. Your father has been worried." "My father," Clara said, and was distantly proud of how steady her voice came out, "signed away any claim to worry about me when he signed that contract." Victor's eyes moved to Eli, back to Clara. A slight pause, the kind that contained an entire reassessment. "This must be the rancher," he said pleasantly. "Mr. Mercer, is it? I appreciate that you've looked after her, and I want you to know there's no ill will here. This is a misunderstanding, and it can be resolved simply." Clara had an agreement. "The agreement was between you and her father," Eli said. "She wasn't party to it, and she's my wife now on record with the county, which makes your agreement about as binding as newspaper." The pleasant expression on Victor's face did not change. That was the thing Clara had always found most frightening about him. His pleasantness never cracked. It just became a different flavor. The flavor it became now was cold and precise. A hasty marriage. Victor said, "Contracted under duress to circumvent a lawful prior agreement has been overturned in courts before." "This is Wyoming, not Boston," Eli said. "Courts are courts." The dining room had gone very quiet. Mrs. Aldrich behind the counter was not pretending to work. The two ranchers at the back table had stopped eating. Victor Blackwell had come into this town and made an offer of money for information about another man's wife, and every person in that room knew it, and the temperature of the silence had a quality to it that Victor, who was not from here and didn't understand the particular social architecture of a small western town, seemed to be only now beginning to register. "I think," Victor said, looking around the room with a controlled expression, "we should discuss this privately." "There's nothing private to discuss," Clara said. He looked at her, the inventory look. The look that said, "You are an object that has been misplaced, and I am in the process of retrieving you." "Clara," he said, and his voice shifted into something lower, something that had the ghost of a threat in it, the way a closed fist held inside a glove was still a fist. "Your father is very distressed. You left without—" "I left because my father broke 2 of my ribs," Clara said. The room went even quieter, which she hadn't thought was possible. Victor's expression went through something fast and complex and landed back on pleasantness, but it cost him more this time. She could see the cost of it. "That's a very serious accusation." "It's not an accusation," Clara said. "It's what happened. You can call it what you like." "You're not well," Victor said, and something sharp moved under the pleasantness now. "You've been through a difficult time, and you're not thinking clearly. Mr. Mercer, surely you can see that this woman needs—" "What she needs," Eli said, "is for you to finish your coffee, get your horse, and ride back the way you came." Victor looked at him. "I have legal documentation," Victor said, and his voice had dropped all the way. Now the warmth entirely gone, the thing underneath it finally showing. "I have a signed agreement with her father, money-paid correspondence on record. I have lawyers in 3 states and a judge in Denver who owes me a considerable favor. You are a cattle rancher in a territory that isn't even a state yet, and you have—" He glanced around the room with a contempt he finally stopped bothering to conceal. "This. I don't want trouble, but I will have what I came for." The room held its breath. Clara felt it. Then the old fear surging up from somewhere she'd thought she'd managed to bury it. The absolute certainty drilled into her over years that men like Victor Blackwell always won in the end because they had money and law and the fundamental assumption of the world that they were right. She felt her hands go cold. Felt the edges of the room sharpen the way they did when her body was preparing for impact. And then she felt something else. Eli's hand at the small of her back. Not gripping her, not holding her in place. Just there. Present. Steady. The way he was always steady, the way she'd been learning for months. That steady was not weakness. Steady was the thing that stayed when everything else moved. She stepped forward, not behind him. In front of him. Beside him. Her own 2 feet on the floor of this dining room in Red Hollow, Wyoming, with the ring on her finger and the roses coming up at her house, and 4 months of learning that she was allowed to take up space. She looked directly into Victor Blackwell's eyes. "I would rather die free beside this cowboy," she said, and her voice came out clear and hard as creek ice, "than spend one more day owned by you." Victor stared at her. "You don't," he started. "She's done talking to you," Eli said from beside her. And from the back table, one of the rancher's old Cal Deering, who had been in this county longer than the territory, had been a territory, pushed back his chair and stood up. He didn't say anything, he just stood. The second rancher stood up. Mrs. Aldrich put down her cloth and crossed her arms. Victor Blackwell looked at the room. He looked at Clara. He looked at Eli standing next to her with the flat, decided look of a man who had already worked out every sequence and was simply waiting for Victor to pick one. Something moved across Victor's face that Clara had never seen there before. He picked up his newspaper, folded it. "This isn't finished," he said quietly. "For today it is," Eli said. Victor left money on the table for the coffee. He walked out. The door closed, and Clara's legs decided right then that they'd had enough. She didn't fall. She grabbed the back of a chair and held on, and Eli was right there, his hand at her elbow, not making a scene of it, just there. "Easy," he said low only for her. "I'm fine," she said, which was approximately 30% true. "You were incredible," he said, which was something he'd never said to her before, and the directness of it, no qualification, no performance, hit her somewhere completely unprepared, and she had to look at the floor for a moment. Cal Deering stopped beside them on his way out and said to no one in particular, "Man like that comes back around, he'll find the whole county's got a long memory." He put on his hat and left. Mrs. Aldrich brought Clara a glass of water without being asked. Clara drank it and breathed, and slowly carefully let go of the chair back. "He'll do what he said," she told Eli when they were outside. "He doesn't make empty threats. He'll find the judge in Denver. He'll find a legal angle. "I know," Eli said. "So what do we do?" He was quiet for a moment. "We go home. We send a wire to a lawyer in Cheyenne. I know good man handled a land dispute for me 2 years ago. We document everything. Your father's letter, the contract, your injuries." He helped her onto her horse with a matter-of-factness that was itself a kind of comfort. "And we let Victor Blackwell find out that being right on paper and being right in a Wyoming court with Wyoming witnesses are two completely different things." Clara settled into the saddle. "You're not afraid of him at all," she said, not quite understanding it. Eli considered this seriously the way he considered everything. "I'm afraid of what he could do if we're careless," he said. "That's different from being afraid of him." He mounted his own horse. Men like Victor Blackwell count on people being afraid of them specifically. Take that away and they're just men with lawyers. Clara thought about Victor's face when the room had stood up, the way something had moved across it that she'd never seen there before. She thought she knew now what that something was. He had walked into Red Hollow expecting to be the most powerful thing in the room. He had found out he was not. "He'll be back," she said again. "Maybe," Eli said. "But he'll come back knowing what's waiting." He glanced over at her. "You did good in there." "I was terrified." "I know." He held her gaze for a moment. "You did it anyway. That's all brave is." They rode back toward Broken Ridge in the late afternoon side by side, and Clara kept the ring on her finger turned so the light caught it, and she thought about what Eli had said. That's all brave is. She turned it over in her mind the whole ride home, and by the time the ranch came into sight, she had decided something not dramatically, not with ceremony, just quietly. The way she'd decided most things lately that actually stuck. She was done letting Victor Blackwell live in her body. He could come with his lawyers and his Denver judge and every piece of paper her father had signed. He would find a woman who had learned to stand on her own 2 feet in a Wyoming courtroom with her husband beside her and a whole county behind her, and she would not flinch. She was done flinching. That night after dinner, after Tom had gone to the bunkhouse and Pete had stopped trying to teach the barn cat tricks and given up for the evening, Clara came into the sitting room where Eli was reading and sat down, not in her chair, but on the settee beside his. He looked up. She didn't have words for exactly what she meant, so she did the thing she'd been slowly learning to do, which was to trust him enough to act without the words. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He went still for one moment, the held breath of someone managing surprise. And then his arm came around her, and he went back to his book, and she sat there in the lamplight, listening to the Wyoming night outside, and feeling the warmth of him along her side, and the steadiness of his breathing. She thought about the roses, about 8 months ago, when she'd been in her father's house with broken ribs and a borrowed address on a piece of paper, and no plan beyond a way. She thought about how far away she'd managed to get. "Eli," she said quietly. She almost said it. Almost. The word was right there, simple and enormous. 3 letters that would change the particular balance of what they were. Instead, she said, "Thank you for today." His arm tightened briefly. Released. "Wasn't just me," he said. "No," Clara agreed. It wasn't. She stayed where she was until the lamp burned low, and he stayed where he was, and outside the Wyoming dark, pressed against the windows, and somewhere out there, Victor Blackwell was riding back to whatever town he'd come from, carrying his humiliation and his promised revenge. Clara closed her eyes. She was not afraid, or rather, She was the way you were always afraid of something real. But the fear no longer had the house. It was outside where it belonged, with the dark and the wind and the things that threatened but had not yet arrived. In here there was lamplight. In here there was a man who had loaded his rifles quietly and said, "Ain't nobody taking my wife," and meant both the legal and the everything else. In here she was home. She pressed her hand over Eli's where it rested at her shoulder and felt him turn his hand over to hold hers, and stayed. The letter from Victor's lawyers arrived on a Friday. Clara was in the kitchen when Tom brought it in from town, and she knew what it was before she even turned it over. The weight of it, the quality of the paper, the seal pressed into the wax with the particular authority of men who charged by the hour and wanted you to feel every cent. She set it on the table and looked at it for a long moment without touching it. Eli came in from the barn, read her expression, looked at the envelope, and pulled out a chair. "Sit down," he said. "I'm sitting?" "You're standing very still and looking at that envelope like it might bite you." "It might," she said. He picked it up, broke the seal, and read it. She watched his face. The stillness came, that focused processing quiet, and then something settled in his jaw that she recognized as the specific set of a man who had already decided and was simply confirming the details. "They're claiming the marriage was contracted under coercion," he said, "filing a petition to have it reviewed by a territorial judge. They want a hearing in Cheyenne in 6 weeks. Clara pressed her hands flat on the table. "Can they do that? They can file anything." He folded the letter. "Whether it goes anywhere is different." "Eli." She waited until he looked up. "Tell me honestly, can Victor actually undo this?" He held her eyes. "Not if we show up in Cheyenne with witnesses' documentation and a lawyer who knows what he's doing." A beat. "And not if the woman standing in front of that judge tells the truth about her father and about what Victor Blackwell is." "That's a lot of conditions. None of them are hard," he said. "We have the witnesses. Tom, Pete, Judge Harlan, Mary Haskell, half of Red Hollow. We have the documentation. I've been keeping records since before you arrived." He set the letter down. "The only thing I need to know is whether you're willing to stand up in a Cheyenne courtroom and say out loud what you told me in this kitchen." Clara thought about her father's parlor, about the contract already signed, about Victor's inventory look and her own voice coming out clear as creek ice in the Red Hollow dining room saying, "I would rather die free." "Yes," she said. "Then we go to Cheyenne," Eli said, and that was the end of the discussion. He sent the wire to his lawyer in Cheyenne that afternoon. The response came back within 2 days, 4 lines, terse and confident, the kind of response that cost money and was worth it. Clara read it twice and felt something loosen in her chest. What followed was 3 weeks of paperwork statements and the peculiar siege mentality of people preparing for a legal fight, organized, focused, and quietly furious beneath the surface. Tom wrote out a statement in his careful hand about the state Clara had arrived in, the way she'd flinched, the time he'd waited out her panic attacks in the barn without comment. Pete wrote one too shorter and slightly misspelled but genuine in a way that made Clara press her lips together hard when she read it. Mary Haskell sent a letter that was 3 pages long and included a description of Victor Blackwell's behavior in Red Hollow that would have made him wince if he'd ever seen it. And Clara herself wrote in her clearest hand a full account of everything. The contract, the conversation with her father, the broken ribs, the 2 dinners with Victor, the rumors about his previous wives the night she'd taken what money she could find and walked out of her father's house at midnight and never looked back. She wrote it all. Every word she'd spent years learning not to say out loud. When she was done, she brought it to Eli and put it on the table in front of him. "Read it," she said. He looked at her. "Please," she said. "I need someone who knows me to read it before a room full of strangers does." He read it, all of it. She watched him the whole time, the small movements of his face that she'd learned to read like weather, the slight tightening when he reached the part about the ribs, the absolute stillness when she described Victor's first wife and the staircase. When he finished, he set it down and looked at her. "Clara," he said. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before, something low and careful, and entirely sincere. This is going to win. She let out a breath she'd been holding for 3 weeks. You think so? Any judge who reads this and still sides with Victor Blackwell is a judge who's already been paid to, he said. And our lawyer will have asked around about Denver judges before we set foot in that courtroom. He slid the pages back to her. You did this. You wrote this. No one told you what to say. She picked up the pages and straightened them and said, You told me the truth was worth saying. I told you a lot of things, he said. You're the one who said them. They went to Cheyenne on a Wednesday in October, when the aspen were gold on the hillsides, and the air had the sharp promise of early winter in it. The courtroom hearing lasted 4 hours. Victor's lawyers were good, smooth, prepared, articulate, in the particular professional way of men who spent their lives turning other people's realities into legal arguments. They made the marriage sound hasty and suspicious. They made Clara sound unstable and impulsive. They produced the contract with her father's signature, which was real and binding, and had the weight of Eastern law behind it. And then Clara's lawyer put Clara on the stand, and she answered every question in the same clear, level voice she'd used in the Red Hollow dining room, and she did not flinch, and she did not elaborate unnecessarily, and she did not look at Victor once. She looked at the judge. She told him the truth, all of it. The signed contract she'd never been shown. The broken ribs. The 2 wives dead under circumstances no one had looked at closely enough. The midnight departure. The advertisement. The letter she'd written to 3 ranchers and the one who'd written back in full sentences. Victor's lawyers objected. The judge sustained some and overruled others and wrote things down with an expression that revealed nothing. Eli sat in the gallery behind the low fence, and Clara could feel him there without looking the specific quality of his stillness that she'd learned to read. As I am here, I am not moving. Nothing is going to happen to you today. It helped more than she would ever know how to say. When the judge called a recess and came back 30 minutes later, he looked at both tables with the flat equanimity of a man who had heard most things and been surprised by very few. He ruled in Clara's favor on every count. The contract, he said, was unenforceable against a party who had never consented to it and had demonstrably fled under duress. The marriage was valid. Any further attempt to interfere with Mrs. Mercer's person or property would be treated as harassment under territorial law. Victor sat across the room and did not move. His lawyers were already leaning in, already talking low and fast, already calculating the next angle. But the ruling was there, on the record, in Cheyenne. Clara walked out of that courthouse on Eli's arm and stood in the October air and said nothing for a moment because there were no words that were right-sized for it. Well, Eli said. Well. Clara agreed. Tom, who had made the trip as a witness and was waiting on the steps, looked at their faces and said, Good, with such economy and satisfaction that Clara almost laughed. Pete beside him said yes, loudly enough that several passers-by looked over and then had the grace to look embarrassed about it. Clara laughed. She pressed her face briefly against Eli's shoulder and laughed and felt his hand come up to the back of her head warm and steady, and she let herself be held for one moment in the middle of Cheyenne on a Wednesday in October. It was the first time she had ever cried because something good had happened. She hadn't known you could do that. The night they got home, Clara Mercer made a decision. Not a calculated one. Not a strategic one. Not the kind she'd spent years making, the kind that were really just survival plans wearing the costume of choices. This was something different. This was the quiet, certain arrival of a feeling that had been building for months, and it had finally gotten too large to keep making room for anything else. She went to Eli's door and knocked. He opened it. He was still dressed. He'd been up reading, she could tell from the lamp, the book face down on the bedside table. He looked at her and waited the way he always waited, without filling the silence with his own assumptions. She said, I don't want to sleep with the bolt on anymore. He held her gaze for a long moment. Clara, he said carefully, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said. That's what I'm telling you. I'm not saying it because I owe you anything. Not because we won in Cheyenne. Not because you've been patient, and I feel like I should reward that." She stopped, found the real sentence underneath all the ones she'd almost said. "I'm saying it because I want to. Because I've wanted to for a while, and I've been letting the fear decide for me, and I'm done letting the fear decide." Eli didn't move for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "You're sure?" "I'm sure," she said. He reached out and took her hand slowly, the way he did everything, giving her time to pull back, and said, "Then come in." What followed was nothing like anything Clara had understood intimacy to be. Not the performance she'd been taught it was. Not the transaction she'd been warned it would become. Not the thing she'd spent years bracing herself against. It was slow and careful, and there were moments where she went still without meaning to, and Eli stopped without being asked, and waited without explanation for as long as it took, and then asked her directly, "Still? Okay. Still here." And she found that being asked, being seen and checked on, and given the choice every single time, dismantled something in her that she hadn't known could be dismantled. She cried at one point quietly, and it wasn't grief, and it wasn't pain. It was the particular overwhelm of something that had been braced for a long time, finally unclenching. Eli didn't ask her to explain it. He pulled her closer and said, "Take your time," against her hair, and she did. Afterward, she lay in the dark and felt like herself in a way she hadn't since before she could remember. "Eli," she said. I love you." She said it into the dark to the ceiling because she'd been carrying it long enough, and it needed to be said out loud in this room on this night. I've been meaning to tell you for weeks. I kept finding reasons not to." Silence. Then he said, "I know." She turned her head. "You know, the coffee," he said. "Every morning, both sides of the table. The way you sit a little closer every week. The book of Whitman you left on my side of the desk." A pause. "A man pays attention." "You could have said something." "Waiting for you to be ready," he said simply. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Did you know you loved me?" she asked. "Before tonight." He was quiet long enough that she turned to look at him. He was looking at the ceiling too, with that particular expression she'd come to recognize as him, finding the precise, honest answer. "The morning you put the coffee on my side of the table," he said. "The 8th day. I thought, there it is. There's the problem." A dry pause. Took me considerably longer to decide it wasn't actually a problem. She stared at him. "You thought falling in love with your wife was a problem." "Didn't know yet if you'd ever want to stay," he said. "Seemed unkind to need something from you that you might not be able to give." Clara looked at the man beside her, this specific, impossible, carefully honest man, who had written back when he could have not written, and loaded his rifles quietly, and given her a room with a lock only she controlled, and built a garden because she'd mentioned roses once, and loved her from the 8th day without telling her, so she'd never feel obligated. "Eli," she said. "You are the most aggravating person I have ever liked." He said again with more agreement in it. She settled against his side, and he pulled the blanket up, and outside the Wyoming dark did its thing against the windows, and inside the house was warm and entirely, completely quiet. She slept without waking once. The months that followed changed everything and nothing, and both at the same time. The ranch prospered in the specific way that things prosper when two capable people who trust each other are running them together, not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently. Clara took the books and the supply ordering and the correspondence entirely in hand, and found she was genuinely good at it, not just adequate. She could read a market fluctuation and plan 3 months out, and argue intelligently with the livestock broker from Laramie, who had been overcharging Eli for years on the assumption that ranchers didn't read closely. He'd been wrong about that. Eli expanded the cattle operation into a corner of the North Range that had been sitting idle, and Tom hired on 2 more hands for the summer drive, and Broken Ridge started turning the kind of numbers that meant they were building something real, rather than just maintaining what was. But the thing Clara hadn't expected, the thing that surprised her more than any of it, was Red Hollow. She had arrived in that town as a stranger with bruises and a flinch, and a reputation as the Eastern woman who'd made a scene getting off the stagecoach. She had expected to remain a stranger for a long time. She'd been a stranger most of her life. What she hadn't counted on was Mary Haskell. Mary had the particular social architecture of a woman who had been in a place long enough to be trusted by everyone and was selective about what she did with that trust. She had decided somewhere between the jar of preserved peaches and the Cheyenne courthouse that Clara Mercer was worth investing in. And Mary Haskell investing in a person looked like introducing them to other people in ways that made those people's opinions shift before they'd even had a conversation. So Clara found herself over the course of months woven into Red Hollow in ways she hadn't navigated, simply arrived in. Mrs. Aldrich at the counter, who had put a glass of water in her hand without being asked. Cal Deering, who had stood up. Judge Harlan, who was dry and practical and had married them in 11 minutes and was now, she realized, something like an ally. And then came the fire. It started on the Renfrew farm east of the creek, a dry August lightning, a barn full of summer hay that went up fast and wrong. By the time anyone knew how serious it was, the wind had shifted and the fire was moving toward the Haskell property and the two smaller farms between them. Clara heard the bell from town, the emergency signal, 3 rings and then 3 more while she was working in the garden. She was on her horse before she'd made a conscious decision to be. What she found when she got there was organized chaos, men arriving with water wagons and shovels, women pulling livestock out of outbuildings, children being moved to higher ground away from the smoke. The fire was on the eastern edge of the Haskell barn and moving in the direction of the feed store. Clara didn't think about it. She just saw what needed doing. She organized the women into a line moving water. She sent Pete, who was fastest on horseback, to the 2 farms downwind to start evacuation before the fire reached them. She found Mary Haskell standing in front of her house, watching her barn burn, and said, Mary, look at me. What's inside that you need?" and got her moving. She worked for 4 hours. When the fire was out, stopped by the creek line on one side, and the fire break the men dug on the other, she was covered in ash and her hands were burned on the backs from carrying buckets, and she was sitting on a fence rail next to Mary Haskell. Both of them too tired to stand when Mary said without looking at her, 3 years I've lived next to people who needed help and managed to sit on their hands. You got here in 20 minutes and had everyone moving. I just saw what needed doing, Clara said. That's the whole thing, isn't it? Mary looked at her. That's what most people can't manage. Clara looked at her burned hands and thought about the woman who'd arrived in this county 8 months ago with a suitcase and a plan that extended no further than away. That woman had been many things: resourceful, determined, absolutely hollowed out. She had not been this. This was something else, something she was still learning the shape of. Eli found her there when he rode in from the North Range. He came to where she was sitting on the fence, looked at her hands, and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "You're burned." "I know." He took both her hands in his and looked at them carefully, and she watched him do it. The clinical attention, the suppressed something underneath it that she recognized now as the specific fear a person had when they loved you and you'd been in danger. "I'm fine," she said. "I know." He didn't let go of her hands. "Tom said you ran the whole water line." "I helped." "He said you organized it." "Someone had to." Eli looked at her, that open, unguarded expression she'd first seen in the barn when she'd laughed, the one that appeared when he hadn't had time to put anything over the top of his actual feeling. "Clara Mercer," he said. "What?" "You know what?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Come home," she said. "I want to clean up and eat something and sit on the porch with you." "Yes, ma'am," he said. He helped her off the fence, and his hand stayed at her back all the way to the horses, and she let it. The telegram came on a Thursday in November, 6 weeks later. Eli brought it in from town and set it on the kitchen table. Without reading it, the envelope was addressed to Clara. She looked at the return address, and her heart did something complicated and fast, and she opened it. It was from a lawyer she didn't know in Boston. It informed her formally and briefly that Mr. Victor Blackwell had died 11 days prior, found at the bottom of his private back staircase. The death had been ruled accidental, a fall, during what witnesses described as a state of considerable intoxication. Clara read it twice. She set it down. She sat very still for a moment, and then she started to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, sustained release of something that had been held under enormous pressure for a very long time. The kind of crying that had nothing theatrical in it. The kind that came from a place below the place where performance lived. Eli sat down next to her and put his arm around her and said nothing. She didn't need him to say anything. When it passed, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at the telegram on the table. "The same thing that happened to his wives," she said. "Yes," Eli said. "I should feel—" She stopped, tried again. "I don't know what I should feel." "You feel what you feel?" he said. "There's no should." She picked up the telegram, set it back down. "I spent 8 months being afraid of that man, being afraid he would come back, that the lawyers would find an angle, that one morning I'd look up and he'd be there." She looked at her hands. The faint pink scars from the fire were fading, but still visible. "And now he's just gone." "Yes," Eli said again. "Is it wrong," she said quietly, "that I'm not sorry?" He thought about it. Really thought in the way she'd come to love about him, treating her questions like they deserved actual consideration. "No," he said finally. "He was a dangerous man who hurt people who couldn't fight back. The world isn't worse without him in it." Clara exhaled. She stood up, went to the window. Outside, the Wyoming November was doing its gray and windy thing, and the cottonwood tree at the edge of the yard had lost all its leaves, and the mountains beyond were white at their tops. "Eli," she said. "Yeah. I think I'm finally free." She said it quietly to the window, to the mountains, and the gray sky, and the bare tree, and the whole wide western world outside that glass. Said it to all of it, the way you said something that needed more than one witness. Behind her, she heard him stand. She heard him cross the room. His hands came to her shoulders from behind, warm, steady, certain. And she felt him press his forehead briefly to the back of her head, and he said low and sure, "You've been free since the day you got off that stagecoach, Clara. You just couldn't feel it yet." She put her hands over his, where they rested on her shoulders, and held on and stood at the window in the Wyoming November, and felt in a way that had no performance in it, no survival strategy, no careful management of a dangerous situation, that he was right. She had made herself free. Everything after was just learning to live there. Spring came to Broken Ridge the way it always did, without asking permission, without announcing itself. Just arriving one morning in the smell of the ground, and the sound of the creek running hard with snowmelt, and the particular quality of the light through the kitchen window that made everything look like it was being seen for the first time. Clara knew she was pregnant before she told Eli. She knew for 3 days, carrying the knowledge around with her the way she'd carried so many things over the years, quietly, carefully checking it from different angles before she trusted it enough to speak out loud. She told him on a Sunday morning. She came downstairs, poured 2 cups of coffee, set his on his side of the table, the way she had every morning since the 8th day, and sat down. He came in from the early check and pulled off his hat and stopped when he saw her face. "What?" he said. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He looked at her with those watercolored eyes, and she looked back and she said, "We're going to need a bigger house." He was quiet for 2 full seconds. "Clara, the room at the end of the hall is too small," she said. "You'd know that if you'd ever actually been inside it, which you haven't because of the bolt, and also you're very respectful of boundaries, which I appreciate, but the point is—" "Clara." "Yes." "Are you?" "Yes," she said. "Sometime in October, I think." Eli set down his cup. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at them, and she watched something move across his face that she had no word for. Not happiness exactly, or not just happiness. Something larger than that, the look of a man who has been shown something he didn't know how to ask for. October, he said. Around then. He looked up. Are you scared? He asked. She considered it honestly the way he'd taught her to consider things. Yes, she said. Some. Are you? Yes, he said immediately, which surprised her and then didn't, because that was the thing about Eli Mercer, he never dressed up his answers. Well, Clara said. Good, means we're both paying attention. The corner of his mouth moved. That almost smile she'd catalogued from the very first weeks that was now so familiar, it felt like breathing. Tom's going to be insufferable, Eli said. Tom is going to be wonderful about it and pretend he isn't, Clara said. Pete is going to be insufferable. Pete's going to cry, Eli said with certainty. Clara smiled. Yes, he absolutely is. They were both right. The news moved through Red Hollow, the way all news did in a small town, faster than logic could explain. By afternoon, Mrs. Aldrich at the general store had already set aside a length of soft yellow flannel. Mary Haskell rode over before supper with a preserved peach cake, and the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this news with considerable patience and was now entirely justified. Finally, Mary said, walking past Clara into the kitchen without knocking, which was something she'd started doing around month 4 of their friendship, and Clara had stopped registering as anything other than normal. It's been less than a year, Clara said. I know exactly how long it's been. Mary set the cake on the table. Eli, you look terrified. I look fine, Eli said. You look terrified and it's very sweet. Mary sat down. Now, there are things to discuss. What followed was 2 hours of Mary Haskell discussing things that needed discussing with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had raised 3 children and helped birth 7 more in her county, and considered herself a regional authority on the subject. Eli absorbed all of it with the same focused patience he applied to everything, asking precise questions that made Mary look at him with visible approval. You're going to be a good father, Mary told him on her way out. Eli looked at the floor for a moment. I hope so, he said. Mary patted his arm. You already are. You've just been practicing on a wife. Clara behind her pressed her lips together hard. After Mary left, Eli stood in the kitchen with his hands in his pockets and said without turning around, Did she just compare you to a child? I think she compared you to a parent, Clara said. Which is different and also much nicer. He turned. His face had that open quality again, the one that appeared when he'd stopped managing his expression. She's right, though, he said quietly, about the practicing. Clara crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him. Eli, I didn't know how to do any of this, he said. Before you. The house it was just a place I worked and slept. Tom and Pete and the cattle and the books. I didn't. He stopped, found the right words. I didn't know what I was waiting for until you got off that stagecoach and told me not to touch your bag. Clara looked at him. You, she said, were absolutely certain I was going to be a disaster. I thought you were going to leave inside a week, he agreed. And yet you loaded the rifles. And yet, he said. She put her hand against his face, the scarred side, the side she'd learned he sometimes angled away without thinking about it. The side she'd made a quiet point of touching first, whenever she reached for him, until he'd stopped doing it. He turned into her palm, the way he always did now. You were the first good thing I let myself want, she said. In a very long time. I want you to know that. He covered her hand with his. October, he said. October, she confirmed. Their daughter arrived in early October, which was on schedule, and she came into the world with the specific loud determination of someone who had strong opinions about her own arrival and intended everyone to know it. They named her Rose. It was not a complicated decision. Eli held her in the first hour with the careful, slightly stunned expression of a large man who has just been handed something extraordinarily small and extraordinarily important, and is making absolutely certain his hands know what they're doing. He stood at the window with Rose against his chest and Clara, exhausted and watching from the bed, saw him look down at his daughter and say something too quiet for her to hear. "What did you say?" she asked. He looked up. His eyes were red at the edges, which he was not acknowledging, and she was choosing not to mention. "Told her she was safe," he said. "Figured that was the most important thing to start with." Clara pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment. "Yes," she said when she could. That was the right thing. Rose grew the way the roses in the garden grew, with her own particular stubborn rhythm, at her own pace, spectacularly indifferent to anyone's expectations. She had Eli's coloring, and Clara's mouth, and a temperament that combined the best and most exhausting qualities of both of them. She was walking at 10 months and talking at 11, and by the time she was 2, Tom had given up trying to keep her out of the barn and simply accepted that she lived there part-time. Pete taught her to whistle. Clara would never entirely forgive him for that either. The schoolhouse happened because of Mrs. Danforth. Margaret Danforth arrived in Red Hollow on a Wednesday in April, with 4 children and no husband. He'd died of fever over the winter, and nowhere to go, and no particular plan beyond West, which Clara recognized immediately as her own story, wearing a different coat. She met Margaret at Mrs. Aldrich's store on the day she arrived, and within 20 minutes, she'd brought her home for dinner, which became for a week, which became through the following month, while Margaret found her footing. During that month, Clara had 3 conversations with Eli about what Margaret needed, and by the end of the 3rd conversation he said, "You want to build a school." "The children have nowhere to learn," Clara said. "And their mothers have nowhere to go," he said, "when they're in a situation like Margaret's." "Yes," Clara said. "Exactly that." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you need?" She had the figures ready. She'd known she would need them known. The conversation would go this way. Land lumber a teacher's salary for the first year until the county took it on officially. She laid it out the way she laid out everything clearly, completely, without apology for what she was asking. Eli listened, nodded twice, said, "I'll talk to Cal Deering about the county contribution. He's been trying to get a school district established for 3 years. He'll want in on this." Clara looked at him. "You already knew I was going to ask," she said. "I knew since the day you reorganized the account books," he said. "Woman who can see what's inefficient and fix it doesn't stop at ledgers." He picked up his coffee. "Also, Mary Haskell told me 2 weeks ago." "Of course she did," Clara said. "The schoolhouse went up that summer. Cal Deering did want in on it, came in fact, with more than his share of the lumber costs and a school board petition signed by 47 county residents that made the territorial office move considerably faster than it might have otherwise. Margaret Danforth became the first teacher. Clara became the person you came to when you needed to know how any of it worked. The word spread, the way things spread in the West, not through newspapers or official channels, but through women talking to women, the oldest and most reliable telegraph system in human history. There was a woman in Red Hollow, they said, who had come west with nothing and built something real. Who had stood in the Red Hollow dining room and told Victor Blackwell she would rather die free. Who ran the books at Broken Ridge like a professional, who had organized the fire response, who had built the schoolhouse, and who, this part was said quietly passed from ear to careful ear, would know what to do if you were in trouble. The kind of trouble you couldn't say out loud to just anyone. The first woman came in the late spring after the schoolhouse opened. She arrived at the ranch door with a bruised jaw and 2 small children, and the specific expression that Clara recognized in the way you recognize your own face. The look of someone who has been waiting to find out if the world had any option left that wasn't the one they'd already tried. Clara opened the door all the way. "Come in," she said. "There's food on the stove, and the children can sleep in Rose's room." The woman looked at her. "I don't know how long. We'll figure that out tomorrow," Clara said. "Tonight you eat and you sleep, and nothing happens to you in this house. That's the whole plan for tonight." The woman's face did the thing Clara's face had done on the 8th day, when Eli had set food on the table, without being asked, that particular crack in the armor that comes when someone treats you like a person, after a long time of being treated otherwise. She came in. There were others after her. Not a flood. Clara was deliberate and careful about it because her resources were real, and she was not going to promise what she couldn't deliver. But a steady ones and twos women who needed a bridge between where they were and somewhere else. And Clara built those bridges with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. Eli never once questioned it. He expanded the second floor, built 2 additional rooms, never mentioned the expense. She asked him about it one evening directly. "The rooms," she said. "You didn't ask me." "You didn't ask me about the ledger system," he said. "Or the roses. Some things you just do." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "I love you," she said. She said it easily now, the way you said things that had long ago stopped being terrifying because they'd become simply true. "I know," he said. She threw her dish towel at him. He caught it without looking up. The vow renewal was Mary Haskell's idea, which meant it was inevitable. 10 years, Mary said, appearing in Clara's kitchen on a Tuesday with the purposeful energy of a woman who had already made most of the decisions. That's significant. That deserves more than a regular Sunday. Mary. The cottonwood in your front yard has been the same tree for 100 years. It would make a beautiful. Mary. I'm already talking to Judge Harlan. Clara put down the bread she was making. Of course you are. He's enthusiastic. Of course he is. She brought it to Eli that night, expecting some version of quiet resistance. He was not a man who sought ceremony. He listened to her explain Mary's vision, and then he said, "The cottonwood. Apparently it's been there 100 years. I know," he said. "I climbed it when I was 7. My grandmother's farm was 2 miles east." He paused. "This used to be her land. She sold it before she died." Clara stared at him. "You never told me that." "Didn't know how to early on," he said. "Felt strange wanting the land back so much. Like it was about something more than cattle." "It was about something more than cattle," Clara said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "The cottonwood. All right, tell Mary yes." Clara told Mary yes. The whole county came. She had not expected the whole county. She had expected perhaps 30 people, and gotten something closer to 100, because 10 years in Red Hollow was apparently long enough that what happened to Broken Ridge Ranch was felt as something that happened to everyone. Cal Deering came. Mrs. Aldrich came, closed the store for the afternoon, for the first time in living memory. Pete, who was now 28 and married, and had a small ranch of his own 3 miles north, came with his wife and his son, who was 2 years old, and had inherited Pete's exact brand of cheerful chaos. Tom Briggs came and stood at the edge of things, the way he always did, watching with the private satisfaction of a man who had been there from the beginning. Margaret Danforth came with her 4 children, who were not children anymore but young people, who had grown up in the schoolhouse that Clara had built. And there were women Clara didn't know by face, women who had come through in the years between, who had used Broken Ridge as a bridge to somewhere better, and had then built lives in those somewhere betters, and had come back, some of them, to stand under this cottonwood tree on this particular Sunday. She hadn't known they would come. She stood among them in her good dress with Rose on one side. Rose, who was 9 years old, and had her father's stillness, and her mother's complete refusal to accept any situation as fixed, and the new small weight of their second child barely showing, and Eli beside her, and she looked at the 100 people under this 100-year-old tree, and felt something she had no word for that encompassed all the smaller words, grateful, astonished, anchored home. Judge Harlan married them again in 9 minutes, because he was 3 years older and slightly less patient than he'd been the first time. The words were the same words they'd said 10 years ago in his office with Tom as witness, and Pete hovering in the hallway. They meant something different now, not because the words had changed, but because the people saying them had the way everything true deepens the longer you live inside it. When it was done, Eli turned to her and said quietly, only for her, "Still the best decision I ever made." "Writing back?" she asked. "Writing back," he confirmed. Rose between them said, "Can we eat now?" with the practical urgency of a 9-year-old who had been patient long enough, and Eli looked down at her with that open expression Clara had first seen in the barn when she'd laughed and said, "Yes, now we eat." That evening, after the 100 people had eaten Mary Haskell's food and gone back to their own lives and their own homes, after Pete had cried exactly as predicted and pretended he hadn't, after Rose had fallen asleep in Tom's wagon on the way back to the house, and Eli had carried her inside without waking her. After all of it, Clara came outside and sat beneath the cottonwood. The night was warm and full of stars, and the Wyoming dark had that particular quality it got in late summer, like the whole sky was leaning down close. Eli came out after her and sat beside her the way he had on that first porch evening, with the Whitman close enough that their shoulders touched. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. She leaned her head back against the tree and looked up through the branches at the stars. "I'm thinking about the stagecoach," she said. "The first 5 minutes, when you reached for my bag and I told you not to." "I remember," he said. "I was so certain," she said, "that I knew what you were, that I knew what any of it was going to be." She turned her head to look at him. I'd gotten so good at bracing for impact that I'd forgotten there was another option. Eli was quiet for a moment. "What changed your mind?" She thought about it. The room with the bolt, the food on the table, 3 rifles loaded without a word about it, a garden turned over because she'd mentioned roses once, a man who read slowly but got there eventually, the dancing in the barn and the Whitman on the porch, and 11 minutes in front of a judge, and 4 hours fighting a fire and a Cheyenne courtroom and a telegram in November, and a daughter named Rose who climbed everything and questioned everything and trusted her father absolutely. All of it. Every day of it. "You did," she said simply. "You just kept being exactly what you said you were, until I couldn't argue with it anymore." He looked at her the way he'd looked at her from the very beginning, steady, patient, entirely real. "Most stubborn woman I ever met," he said. "You married me twice," she said. "That's on you." The almost smile, that precise familiar movement. Then the real one, the full rare version she'd been collecting for 10 years. She put her hand in his, and he held it the way he always held it, with his whole hand, and no performance, and they sat beneath the 100-year-old cottonwood, while Wyoming wheeled its stars overhead, and the house was full of sleeping children. And tomorrow was another ranch morning, and the roses were still growing on the south side of the house. She thought about the woman who had stepped off that stagecoach, terrified of the cowboy waiting for her. The woman who had rehearsed being fine, who had counted exits, who had learned to make herself so small she almost disappeared. The woman who had run as far as she could run and ended up exactly where she was supposed to be. She thought about what that woman had believed, that kindness was always a doorway to control, that gentleness was strategy, that love was just another word for ownership with better manners. She thought about how wrong she had been, and how long it had taken to be proven wrong, and how worth it every difficult day of that proof had been. "Eli," she said. "Thank you for writing back." He turned his head and looked at her, and his face in the starlight was the face she'd been reading for 10 years, every line of it, known every expression, catalogued the scarred side and the steady eyes and the mouth that said very little and meant all of it. "Thank you," he said, "for getting on the stagecoach." Clara looked up through the cottonwood branches at the Wyoming stars. She pressed her husband's hand. She breathed the summer night, and she understood fully and completely, and without any remaining reservation, that fear had brought her here, had driven her onto a stagecoach heading west with a suitcase and a stolen address and nothing left to lose. And love had kept her. Not the trembling, bracing survival mode approximation of love she'd grown up watching, but the real thing, patient, imperfect, daily chosen. Chosen every morning since the 8th day. She had come to Wyoming territory running from everything she feared. She had found the one thing she'd never dared to want. And she had stayed. And the life they built together from 2 people who had each in their own way given up on certain things being possible was proof of the only truth that mattered. That what the world breaks, the right love can build back stronger. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.